riffs are too repetitive, the lyrics make no sense. All the songs are B-sides and the cover art's a mess. There's so much here to tear apart. Listen to it for a week, now that week has passed. Here's why I hate this album podcast with Tim and Garrett.
Hello and welcome to another all-new episode of Why I Hate This Album. I am one of your hosts, Garrett Harvey. Not with me, as always, my co-host extraordinaire, Timothy Richardson. Folks, don't worry. Tim is accounted for. He is actually out leading our annual intern retreat. Typically we have Gino lead this, but come to find out the last couple of years, our producer has been selling our interns as cheap weekend labor under the guise of a ropes course. But in actuality, we believe he was potentially having them sew knockoff Chanel purses. In any event, Gino has been stripped of those responsibilities, and Tim has been hesitantly put in charge of our 43 remaining interns. But that leaves me one man short, and rather than miss a week, folks, we are legally obligated to bring you an episode come hell or high water. So this week, it's just me, but rather than doing a deep dive on a singular musical figure from history, I decided to do something different. A lot of you have suggested several different artists for me to do a solo cast as they become known, and so I've done the research, and in so doing, I've learned a lot of these people didn't have terribly interesting lives. So rather than have people sit through 90 minutes of me telling the story of somebody's life only to get to the good part at the end, I've picked a few interesting stories that all focus around death, potential murder, and mysteries in the music industry. So today I'm going to give you 5 short stories that are all true, that outline the background and raise a lot of fun questions about what may or may not have happened surrounding these people's deaths. Next week, Tim will be back. Everything will be back to normal. Same old podcast where we pick an album, we listen to it for an entire week straight, then we come back and tell you why we hate it. I think next week is Jaden Smith, so that should be a whole pile of nonsense. Sneak peek, gang. Jaden Smith, super into Batman, and it's gonna get weird. This is coming from a guy whose dog's name is Batman. Alright, as always, if you don't know it, you can reach out to us by going to hatePodMail@gmail.com, and we want to hear from you. You can also go to hatepod.com and get every episode we've ever done, even this one here. You can also find us on all your favorite podcasting platforms, and if there's an opportunity for you to rate, review, or subscribe, please do it. It really helps the show. We don't have ads, we don't ask for money. This is really all we want from you. That or tell a friend to listen, or force a friend to listen. Okay, with all that out of the way, folks, let's get into it. I bring you Strange Deaths and Mysteries of the Music Industry, Volume 1. Our first story is about Paul Williams, born July 2nd, 1939 in Birmingham, Alabama. Growing up, he performed in a number of groups before landing in a trio called the Primes and moving to Cleveland, Ohio in 1957. There, they found a manager in Milton Jenkins who moved the group to Detroit, Michigan. The Primes never actually recorded any music, and in 1959 the band began to splinter. They actually launched an all-female spin-off group called the Primettes, who would later be renamed to the much better known The Supremes. 2 years later, the group formally disbanded. Paul and his former bandmate Eddie Kendricks were just hanging out in Detroit when they heard Otis Williams, the head of a rival Detroit act called The Distance, had 2 openings in his group's new lineup. Paul and Kendricks soon auditioned and joined Otis Williams, Melvin Franklin, and Elbridge Bryant to form a new band known as the Elgins. The band signed to the local Motown label in 1961 after first changing their name to the much better The Temptations. Over the course of their career, The Temptations released 4 Hot 100 number 1 singles and 14 R&B number 1 singles. They had won 3 Grammys and were the first Motown recording act to win a Grammy Award for Cloud 9 in 1969. But it wasn't all Grammys and good times for Paul Williams. He suffered from sickle cell anemia and depression. This eventually led to alcohol abuse, which ate away at Paul's health and his ability to perform. Add to that a failed business that had put him in debt to the IRS for about $80,000 or $500,000 in today money. By 1970, the Temptations had to tour with an on-hand replacement for Williams in case he was too sick or too drunk to perform. Finally, in 1971, the band convinced him to see a doctor that found a spot on his liver and advised Paul to quit touring immediately and tend to his health. To help Williams get back on his feet, he was paid 1/5 share of the group's royalties and kept on the payroll as an advisor and choreographer for the next 2 years. Paul attempted a solo career, but his health was continuing to decline, and Motown chose not to release any of the recordings. Then on August 17, 1973, Paul Williams was found dead inside a parked car in an alleyway with a single gunshot wound to the head and the gun in his right hand. According to former bandmate Otis Williams, Paul had expressed suicidal thoughts to him and Melvin Franklin months earlier. Paul's then-girlfriend reports the two had been arguing that evening, and he left visibly upset. Based on the evidence and the statements by his former bandmates, Paul Williams' death was ruled an apparent suicide. The Williams family immediately pointed out several pieces of evidence that imply there may be more to the story. First, Paul Williams was shot on the left side of his head, but his gun was found in his right hand. In order for him to have shot himself, Williams would have had to have reached across his own face and point the barrel of the gun at the side of his head. If you can't quite picture what I'm talking about, pick up your phone, grab it by the bottom where you talk into it, and try with your right hand to reach across your body and point the earpiece to your temple. See, it doesn't make a lot of sense. It's pretty awkward. Second, a bottle of liquor was found by his left hand that had shattered as if he had dropped it unexpectedly when somebody shot him in the head. Third, the gun had been fired twice, but only one bullet was lodged inside Williams. Now it's possible he was testing the gun or he got scared the first time and purposely didn't shoot himself, but it seems unlikely. Finally, there's the scene itself. The story just doesn't make a lot of sense. Why would a man get in his car half-dressed after fighting with his girlfriend, drive a few blocks away, hide in an alley, and then kill himself with the opposite hand? The leading theory is that Williams' girlfriend was actually somebody else's girlfriend, and when he was caught with his literal pants down, he fled the scene. The angry lover took chase, found him in the alleyway, and shot him in the head. This is, of course, impossible to prove, but it is kind of interesting. And while Williams may never have justice for his possible murder, he was recognized as a founding member of the Temptations and was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2013. Elliot Smith was born August 6, 1969 in Omaha, Nebraska. Raised primarily in Texas, he eventually moved to Portland, Oregon in his teens. Elliot struggled with ADHD and depression his whole life, and by his teenage years began abusing alcohol and drugs. In 1991, Smith formed the band Heatmiser while at Hampshire College in Amherst, Massachusetts. He graduated college and moved back to Portland, where the band released some mildly popular albums. During this time, Smith's addiction and depression only became worse. He joked so frequently about suicide that his friends often ignored it. When he did make declarations that he would take his own life, nobody really paid him any attention. At the same time, Smith began his solo career and released his first album, Roman Candle, in 1994. In 1995, Elliot released the self-titled follow-up that almost nobody noticed. In 1997, he released Either Or. Director Gus Van Sant was so impressed that he included 3 songs on the Good Will Hunting soundtrack. Included within those was Miss Misery, which was actually nominated for a Grammy and would help to catapult Elliot to global fame. In 1998, he released XO, and it was his biggest commercial success to date. Both Either Or and XO are personal favorites of mine. They're really good albums, but you have to understand they're tremendously sad albums. They're about Smith's life and struggles with depression, addiction, abuse. These are incredibly sad songs for sad people, so just know what you're getting into. Smith moved to New York in the late 90s, addicted to heroin, and it's alleged that when he left for Los Angeles in 2000, he had added smoking crack to his list of vices. With the release of his next album, Figure 8, there began to be stories that he could no longer perform and forgot the words to his own songs. His neighbors in Silver Lake claimed they would see him wandering the streets some nights, wearing a blanket and just muttering to himself like a homeless man. All seemed lost, but in 2002, Smith turned his life around. He got clean, began to work on his new album, tentatively titled From a Basement on a Hill, and was in a healthy relationship with Jennifer Chiba, who performed in a local punk band called Happy Ending. Smith had even taken the band under his wing and was paying for their production costs as well as allowing them to open up for him on tour. Despite all of this, Elliot Smith died October 21st, 2003, at the age of 34 from 2 stab wounds to the chest. According to Chiba, the two had had an argument at their home in Echo Park, and as the fighting got worse, Smith threatened to commit suicide. Having heard this countless times before, Jennifer ignored him and locked herself in the bathroom. She then heard a scream. When she left the bathroom, she found Smith standing with his back to her. He turned around and revealed the kitchen knife sticking out of his chest. Smith had stabbed himself in the heart, and despite emergency surgery, he was pronounced dead 20 minutes after arriving at the hospital. Given his history, friends, family, fans, including me, were not surprised. But our listeners suggested I look into the details of this case, and I have to admit, after looking at some of it, it is kind of interesting, and while all signs point to this was a very sad man that probably took his life, there's a few things worth pointing out. First are the rumors that Smith and his girlfriend were in a volatile relationship, often compared to Sid and Nancy. They would have epic fights, epic breakups, and then epic makeups only to start over again. Then the Smoking Gun posted the medical examiner's report in the case, and it states, quote, "While the history of depression is compatible with suicide, and the location and direction of the stab wounds are consistent with self-infliction, several aspects of the circumstances, as they are known at the time, are atypical of suicide and do raise the possibility of homicide." The report said that Smith had been stabbed twice. Both wounds had entered the chest cavity and one had perforated his heart, which, as it turns out, isn't that odd. Suicides who choose to stab themselves to death frequently jab the weapon into their chest a number of times. What was strange were there were no hesitation wounds, which are usually found on the person as they work up the nerve to actually go through with it. Also unusual was that he didn't take off his shirt. Now personally, I find the second stab wound a lot more suspicious, but according to the experts, most people who do stab themselves to death, for whatever reason, take their shirt off first. Finally, and most interesting to me, is that there were small lacerations found on both his hands and under his right arm that were consistent as, quote, possible defensive wounds. It also strangely claimed that, quote, the reported removal of the knife from Smith and the subsequent refusal to speak with detectives were all of concern when referencing his girlfriend Jennifer. When the Smoking Gun released the report with those quotes, Chiba released her own statement declaring both her disgust and her innocence in equal parts. In her statement, she claimed that she and Smith's family were in complete and total agreement about everything happening exactly as she said it did, and nobody else needed to ask questions. Then Elliot Smith's family released their own statement saying, quote, "Until such time as the investigation has concluded, however, and especially in light of the recent coroner's report, neither Elliot's family nor anyone else can claim to know the truth about Elliot's death, and any statement to the contrary mischaracterizes the family's position," end quote. Basically saying, we don't agree with her, we don't trust her, and we're going to wait to find out what actually happened to our son. Unfortunately, to this day, no new information has come to light. When I looked up the case on the LA Coroner's website, it is now listed as closed, but the manner of death remains unknown.
Nearly touching this sturdy retreat, falling out.
Not many people know the name Bobby Fuller, and there's a good reason for that. Just as he started to gain fame in the music industry, he died. Bobby was born October 22, 1942 in Baytown, Texas. He was raised in El Paso, where he became enamored with the likes of Elvis Presley and his fellow Texan Buddy Holly. He led an ever-changing lineup of bands as he performed in small bars and nightclubs and recorded to independent record labels with little success. Then in 1964, Bobby moved to LA with his band, the Bobby Fuller Four, and was signed to Mustang Records by producer Bob Keane. Keane was notable for discovering Ritchie Valens and producing several hit surf rock songs. Their first top hit 40 was the self-penned Let Her Dance, but it was the band's second single, I Fought the Law, that turned out to be their biggest hit, peaking at number 9 on the Billboard Hot 100 the week of March 12, 1966. The song was originally written and recorded by Sonny Curtis, who would actually become a member of Buddy Holly's former band The Crickets after Holly's death. Unfortunately, just 4 months later, on July 18, 1966, Bobby Fuller was found dead in his car. The body was soaked in gasoline, and his death was ruled a suicide. According to journalist Dean Kuipers, who claims to have seen the coroner's report, quote, "The medical examiner's report states that Bobby's face, chest, and side were covered in petechial hemorrhages, probably caused by gasoline vapors and the summer heat. He found no bruises, no broken bones, no cuts, no evidence of beating." Where it gets weirder is that according to Kuipers, the boxes for accident and suicide on the report were both checked, but next to the boxes were question marks. Obviously, many people found this suspicious, and the story was even featured on Unsolved Mysteries and All Things Considered. But no one has ever come forward with more information. The only change to the case since he was found that day in his car is that the cause of death was changed after the Unsolved Mysteries episode from suicide to accident, which I'm sure we can all agree makes a heck of a lot more sense. I mean, who listening right now hasn't gone for a good car sleep after a vigorous summer gasoline fight? I know I have. Pretty clear accident. Michael Hutchens was born January 22, 1960 in Sydney, Australia. The family moved around a bit, spending time in Brisbane and Hong Kong before making their way back to Sydney. In his teens, Michael began to jam out in his garage with his friends. His first band, Dr. Dolphin, eventually morphed into a band called the Ferris Brothers in 1977. The band regularly supported local rockers Midnight Oil on the pub rock circuit and were renamed as In Excess in 1979. The band then spent the next several years touring and releasing albums that, while popular in Australia, failed to become worldwide hits. On February 13, 1983, In Excess played the Stop the Drop nuclear disarmament concert to a crowd of 14,000 people at the Myer Music Bowl in Melbourne, alongside Midnight Oil, Colin Hay, Red Gum, and Goanna. The performance was simulcast on Australian TV by Channel 10 and on the radio. That same year, despite having already released 3 albums, the band had their first U.S. performance in San Diego to a crowd of 24. Their first U.S. tour was to support Adam and the Ants, then Stray Cats, the Kinks, Hall & Oates, and the Go-Go's. The band remained on the tour in the U.S. for most of the year, and by mid-1983 were headlining venues like the Ritz in New York. It wasn't really until their 5th album, Listen Like Thieves, was released in October 1985 did the band actually start to take off in the US. But once they did, they became global superstars. Over the next 15 years, In Excess would sell over 30 million albums in the United States alone, making them the 3rd highest-selling Australian music act in the United States, behind AC/DC and the Bee Gees. Even more impressive is that In Excess has sold an estimated 75 million records worldwide. Over his career, Hutchens was known for 2 things: his wild antics both on and off stage, and very public affairs with women. In one such instance, he refused to move for a taxi that was in the road. The driver then got angry, got out, and assaulted him. Michael fell back during the assault and fractured his skull on the pavement. He, of course, did nothing about it for several days, and when he finally did feel the need to go see a doctor, there was nothing that could be done for his now permanent loss of smell and taste. Even worse, people around him began to notice that he had become more aggressive and impulsive. Michael's bandmates claimed that in the 6 weeks after he left the hospital, he attempted to fight every one of them at least once, and several of them multiple times. In April 1997, In Excess set out on tour to support their 10th studio album, Elegantly Wasted. The final shows of the tour were set to take place across Australia to commemorate the band's 20th anniversary. Early on November 20th, 1997, Michael spoke with his girlfriend and mother of his most recent child, Paula Yates. Paula was supposed to meet Michael in Australia with the kids, both theirs and the children of her soon-to-be ex-husband, Bob Geldof. But in the midst of a bitter custody battle, Paula called to let him know that she wouldn't be coming, and Michael in turn called Geldof to plead his case. The occupant of the neighboring room at the hotel Michael was staying at reported hearing shouting from Michael's room multiple times between 5 and 5:30 a.m., during which time Michael called Geldof twice, both times pleading desperately to allow the kids to come visit, and both times Geldof telling him to call back when he was more composed. At 9:54 the same morning, Hutchens called his former girlfriend, Michelle Bennett, and according to Bennett, Hutchens was crying, sounded drunk, and told her he needed to see her immediately. Bennett took off and arrived at his hotel by 10:40 a.m., but there was no response when she knocked at the door. She left a note with the reception but would never hear back. Finally, at 11:50 a.m., Hutchens' body was discovered by a hotel maid. He was found, quote, in a kneeling position facing the door. He had used his snakeskin belt to tie a knot on the automatic door closure at the top of the door and has strained his head forward so much into the loop that he had actually broken the belt buckle off of the belt. What's most interesting about the details of his death is that Michael Hutchens was not nude. His pants weren't even down. There's no reason to think that this was the result of autoerotic asphyxiation gone wrong. That was not the cause of his death. This man hung himself. It was actually his girlfriend Yates who put forward the theory, not willing to believe that Michael could take his own life. She would never recover from Michael's death. Over the next few years, she ended up being committed, attempting to take her own life, and eventually would overdose on heroin, only to be discovered by her and Hutchens' daughter. But there is an actual mystery here. The big question is, where did Michael's vast estate go after his death? You see, as In Excess became global superstars, Hutchens became very paranoid and made moves to attempt to protect his growing fortune. He hired this large team of, quote, trusted advisors and signed over most of his assets to various holding companies in order to protect himself from hangers-on, indemnify him from potential lawsuits, and really to avoid paying taxes. There was this complex web of offshore accounts, holding companies, and various trusts were all set up to hold his assets, including the rights to his intellectual property, meaning that if he wrote anything at all, The moment that he lifted his pen from the paper, it was no longer his property and became the property of one of his trusts or companies. The problem was, Hutchens wasn't the beneficiary of any of these trusts, so when he died, he was technically bankrupt. He didn't have any money, thus nullifying any of the wishes of his will, which was supposed to leave half of his fortune to his daughter. Instead, after his death, the family discovered that 3 Gold Coast properties, a luxury waterfront mansion on the island of Capri, a villa in France, a house in London, an Indonesian development, and numerous other assets weren't technically his. The remaining guitars and various equipment was then seized to cover legal fees, and to this day, not a single cent of Michael Hutchens' vast fortune has ever been recovered. But most importantly, he didn't die trying to JSD. Let's show this man the respect he deserves. Samuel Cooke was born in Clarksdale, Mississippi on January 22, 1931. The 5th of 8 children of the Reverend Charles Cooke, a minister at the Church of Christ, and his wife, Annie Mae. The family moved to Chicago in 1933, and this is where Sam would grow up, performing in small groups with his siblings and school friends. Then, at the age of 19, he replaced the lead singer of gospel band The Soul Stirrers and released several songs with Specialty Records. In 1957, Sam went solo and released a string of hit songs including You Send Me, A Change Is Gonna Come, Cupid, Wonderful World, Chain Gang, Twistin' the Night Away, and many, many more. Now, if you're not up to speed on late 50s, early 60s pop, let's just talk stats. During his brief 8-year career, Sam Cooke released at least 29 songs that charted in the top 40 of the Billboard Pop Singles chart, as well as 20 singles that charted in the top 10 of Billboard's Black Singles chart. Put simply, Sam Cooke had become a superstar in a very short amount of time. Cooke was also among the first black artists to take an active role in the business side of his career. He founded both a record label and a publishing company, as well as taking an active part in the civil rights movement. But then on December 11th, 1964, at the age of 33, Sam Cooke was shot and killed at the Hacienda Motel in Los Angeles, California. The hotel's manager, Bertha Franklin, claimed to have shot him in self-defense. The official story given by the witnesses, and corroborated by lie detector tests, was that the night began with Sam and his date, 22-year-old Alyssa Boyer, having dinner with the producer and his wife. When the producer left, Sam was seen making out with his date in the booth before deciding to return to Sam's room. Now, it should also be mentioned that it's more than a little suspicious that Sam Cooke, noted millionaire at the time, is staying at an incredibly shitty motel, but more on that in a bit. This is where Elisa's account of things begins to come into question. She claimed she did not actually return to the seedy motel voluntarily, but was actually kidnapped. Once there, she worried a fairly inebriated Sam was going to get violent and rape her. Luckily, like most kidnappers, Sam took off most of his clothes and then left his victim unattended while he went to the bathroom. This is when Elisa took all of Sam's clothes and ran from the hotel room. She then ran to a payphone and called the police with the story I just told you. When Cooke left the bathroom and saw his clothes and his date had fled, he ran to the hotel manager's office to ask where she was. Which is, again, sort of an odd place to go to look for your runaway date you may or may not have kidnapped. When Sam came storming into the office, banging on the door, Bertha says a struggle ensued, where she fired 3 shots, hitting Cooke once and killing him. All of that could be 100% true, but there's a couple of additional facts that make people question if this is what really happened. The first is that Alyssa Boyer is reported to not actually have been Sam's date, but rather a prostitute, and the hotel that they returned to, or she was kidnapped to, was actually known to be a hangout for sex workers. Also worth noting is that Bertha Franklin, the hotel manager and shooter, was not just a hotel manager, but actually an ex-madam with her own criminal history. And how ex of a madam she was remains under question. When staff at the restaurant were interviewed about the night, several people commented on the large amount of cash that Sam was carrying and flashing around to anybody who was interested to look. However, when Alyssa was searched, only $20 were found, and there were only a few coins in Sam's Ferrari parked out front. And again, I want to point out, he's at the Hacienda Motel with a date that he took his Ferrari to. Nothing about this seems odd. Now finally, and this is the most speculative of the facts I'll give you, I've read from several sources that those close to Sam report seeing significant physical damage to his body when viewing it at the morgue, as though he had been beaten severely, in addition to the gunshot. It isn't hard to imagine a scheme in which Alyssa was supposed to steal her John's clothes and the money that they contained while he was in the bathroom, dump it with the hotel manager or madam, and then use a payphone to call the police and accuse him of rape, thus distracting him from the burglary, and much happier that he's not being arrested for rape that evening or for soliciting prostitution. Where things might have gone wrong is when an inebriated Sam Cooke took the matter up with her madam or the hotel manager, and things got out of hand. Did some muscle for the hotel/brothel beat Sam half to death and then make it look like self-defense? Or did a drunk man attack a motel worker and she fired a gun scared for her life? We can't actually answer that question. But what's also interesting is, a month after this incident, Alyssa Boyer was arrested for prostitution, and in 1979, she was convicted of second-degree murder of her boyfriend. Bertha had to quit the hotel due to constant death threats for killing Sam Cooke, and then she even sued Sam Estates for a few $100,000. Some sources say that she completely lost and got nothing, but others say that she might have gotten as much as $30,000, but I can't be sure. The small silver lining are the many lives that Sam Cooke touched. He was so celebrated it took 2 funerals to bury him. One was in Chicago, where 200,000 people lined up to pay their respects, and another in Los Angeles a few days later, featuring a who's who of the music world, all there to celebrate an amazing life and a talented artist.
Send me, I know you.
Okay guys, that's it. I hope you enjoyed it. Just 5 short stories to get you through the week. We'll be back to normal next week, as I said at the top. Full disclosure, I may still do a full-length version of the Sam Cooke story. I think that is worthy of a deep dive. He lived quite a life in a very short amount of time, but we just hit the high notes. If I got a detail wrong or I missed some stuff, please feel free to let me know. But at the same time, guys, I'm not the Smithsonian. I'm just one man doing my best, corroborating sources. So if I fucked it up, be nice, let me know, but you don't have to be a shithead about it. Many of you have been very nice lately and asked us, how do we not have more subscribers? How are we not getting more views? Well, guys, that's up to you. We don't advertise and we don't have sponsors. You just got to get the word out there. So let folks know. As always, you can go to hatePodMail@gmail.com, and we want to hear from you. Maybe you can give us other suggestions for an episode like this. Volume 2 could be just around the corner. You never know. You can also reach out to us by going to hatepod.com and clicking contact us in the upper left-hand corner. It does ask for an email address, but that's just so we can reply to you. We don't do anything, as I mentioned. We don't market at you. You can reach out to us on Twitter at @AlbumHatePod or on Instagram at HatePod. I'm on Twitter. This is Garrett at GHarveyTweets. Tim's on Instagram, but he won't let you follow him, so why bother? He'll be back next week for more exciting tales of Tim and Garrett. Until then, folks, I think that's about it. We've got Discord servers, we've got subreddits, we've got Twitter, Instagram. We're on Facebook, but we don't check it, so don't bother. Reach out, tell us your weird stories, suggestions for albums, songs, music, news of the weird, remixes. We've been looking for some new theme songs just to change it up. Send them our way. For Why I Hate This Album, I have been one of your hosts, Garrett Harvey. Returning next week, Timothy Richardson.
There's cowboys running through my dreams. Nothing's quite the way it seems. I joined the Navy, got kicked out in a week. My facial features aren't distinct. Try to find some meaning in these songs. The genius is a genius, got it wrong. No, it's a lobster murder sex thing. It's the bleaching of the rear. A full assault on both your ears. Riffs are too repetitive, the lyrics make no sense. All the songs are B-sides, the cover art's a mess. Listen to it for a week, now that week has passed. It's the Why I Hate This Album podcast with Tim and Garrett.